old-time Highpointers. I guess I'm one of these old-time Highpointers. But I started really early. I was in college when I started all this thing. And, you know, we all have a story about how we started Highpointing. And just as an idea, I thought maybe this is an idea for a publication. Where we could put out a little survey asking everybody to send in about 100 words or less and about how the unique way they got started in Highpointing. Publish it in the bulletin, maybe at some future time. Mine got started in college when I was bored with studies, and I was opening. I love maps and still do, and I opened a random family atlas, and I saw little red squares, you know, in the states. And my home state at that time was Illinois. So while the other kids went down to Fort Lauderdale on spring vacation, guess where I went? I went to Charles Mountain. So, you know, the next few years saw me collecting more high points, and like probably some of you, I thought I was the only one nutty enough to ever do this, you know, and then I found out there was other people doing it too. And I had no idea of that there was already a tiny fraternity of Highpointers that were already engaged in this project. And I also had no idea of the wonderful people that I was going to meet. And soon, a friend in the Sierra Club in Chicago told me that there was a fellow by the name of Rollin Stebbins who lived in Lansing, Michigan, who was already engaged in this project. So off to Lansing, Michigan, I went, and we arrived at Rollin's estate. He was a very wealthy man, lived on in a mansion on the bluff of the Grand River there in Lansing. And down here. And as we walked up to his home, he came out with a croquet mallet. He wasn't going to whack me with it. He just had a big smile on his face. So we went in the backyard and played a game of croquet. And that led to a very fine dinner with Rollin, and meeting his three sons, Winston, who at that time was 20, Malcolm at that time was 19, and Kenyon Stebbins at that time was 17. We had a fine dinner, and Rollin had a housekeeper who brought out dinner. He had a little bell that he'd bring, and his housekeeper come out. I was really impressed. And as the evening went on, the conversation turned to A.H. Marshall, who was the very first to complete the 48 state summits. But before I get to Marshall, a few words about a fellow by the name of Percival Sayward. He, back in 1915, in publication Appalachia, which is the official publication of the Appalachian Mountain Club, wrote an article called "The Highest Point in Each New England State," followed by another article shortly thereafter called 10 Trifling Hillocks. This is 1950. And he really caught the spirit of highpointing, because in 1915, this is what he wrote: "What pleasanter way then could be found of becoming acquainted with the various sections of our country than to make pilgrimages to the culminating point of each state?" As it turned out, he completed completed 44 he completed 18 eastern high points, but did not go on beyond that. And we really don't hear about high pointing until until up in the 30s, when we see Lawrence Grinnell of Ithaca, New York, who became active in high pointing at about the same time as Arthur Marshall. He already had a couple Swiss summits under his belt. Grinnell and Marshall had some friendly competition in the 1934-1935 period, with Marshall sending them regular postcards detailing his progress. Grinnell ended his quest at number 44, so it was up to Art Marshall to take the lead when he ascended Indiana's high point on July 13, 1936. He's the first person to do the high points of the 48 states. Arthur Marshall was a remarkable man. My encounter with him was close in space, but pretty far in time. He lived across the Columbia River from my home in Portland, in Vancouver, but he died about 16 years before I moved to Portland. He lived in the Evergreen Hotel, which still stands in Vancouver. He lived as a bachelor in a 12 by 16 foot room, and lived a simple life. He was a member of Mazamas Climbing Club, of which I am also a member. And the Mazama Climbing Club Annual of 1951 describes Art Marshall as a truly unique individual, having, quote, no like or equal in the mountaineering world. Art was never an expedition climber. Technical routes were not his high point. In fact, he never used piton, carabiner, or rope rappel in his entire life. He just loved mountains, all 622 of them, with 281 solo. Rollin Stebbins, that evening, told me about Marshall, and Rollin had already added 5 summits to his state summit quest, thinking that he was the first, when in 1940, Rollin Stebbins noticed a note on the door of an old shack as he climbed Government Peak, then the highest point of his home state of Michigan. The note, written 4 years earlier in 1936, simply read, 34 state summits, 14 more to go, A.H. Marshall. So, Marshall's accomplishments were all the more unique when we considered that the project took him 17 years to complete, yet he never drove a car, using travel privileges as a telegrapher for the SP&S Railway to travel. Art hired cars and drivers when needed, walked many more miles than you and I ever have to walk today, even to get to trailheads, and slept outside many a night without a tent. He had developed severe rheumatism, which later contributed to a general downturn in his health. He wrote to Stebbins in late 1949 after Rollin visited him in Vancouver, and after Raleigh sent him a photo taken of the two of them, which shows Marshall being very old and bent. Marshall says, I didn't realize how much I failed in the last 3 years. Marshall mentions that the newly resurveyed high points of New Mexico and Rhode Island, he states that he will never find the truth of the problem. A little over a year later, Art Marshall took his own life on February 5th, 1951. He left one of the most amazing records of mountaineering achievement in all of North America. Art's 4 high-pointing journals and many photographs are currently in the possession of Rollin Stebbins' son Ken, who tells me Ken's still around, and he tells me that he's open to donating these to the club, or at least copies of these precious journals to the club. The evenings spent with Rollin Stebbins developed into a friendship marked by several visits and correspondence. Raleigh lent me his voluminous files, which I carefully copied. He later visited me in Portland. Raleigh liked to dine in the highest in altitude restaurant in every city that he visited. And soon we were sharing a meal on the 36th floor of the First National Bank building. Raleigh liked to collect more than just mountains. He skied every state that had, and many countries that had a ski lift. He knew the fight songs from every state university from Maine to California. He had never smoked, drank, or even tasted coffee, tea, or soda. Oh, he would chuckle. If you've never had any of those, you never miss them. Can't apply to us, I guess. You should be here today. But he was a fine physical specimen who climbed hard and played hard. He played handball with his 3 sons and climbed the stairs of Lansing's tallest buildings regularly. Many Highpointers are familiar with Rollins Devon's exploits. Not only was he the second to attain the 48 summits, completing in 1950, but he was the first to attain them a second time with his sons. Raleigh also completed the high points of France, Germany, Switzerland, Portugal, and Italy. When his wife fell ill in 1950 and had to leave their home for care, Raleigh looked for a project to do with his 3 sons, Winston, Lee, and Malcolm. Winston Lee, Malcolm Whitney, named after Mount Whitney, and Kenyon Rainier, named after Mount Rainier. Rollin began retracing his steps to the high points with the 3 boys in 1952, when they were 4, 7, and 9, respectively. The Stebbins family began with the East and Midwest state summits. Then by 1956, we're concentrating on the higher Appalachian summits. Checking off the high points was fun for the 3 boys who eagerly helped Dad plan new objectives. In 1962, Rollin attained the 48 for the second time, with his sons Malcolm Kenyon and Kenyon being the 5th and 6th persons to do the 48 as they topped Mount Rainier. Winston had broken his foot just a few days earlier at a California motel after climbing Mount Whitney. Winston went on to claim the 48 state title by climbing Rainier in '63 to become the 7th to climb the 48. Rollin later added Mauna Kea in 1969, being the 3rd to do the 49. Rollin died in 1983 at the age of 80, leaving a truly unique legacy. Rollin's son, Kenyon, now lives in Michigan, where he still remains a member of the Highpointers Club with his wife, Sally. The Stebbins family not only established a lot of firsts, but started a family tradition that lives today in the club. Ken Stebbins told me that he hopes to come to the Ohio Convention next year to talk about his dad and his early exploits in hiking.